Here are the solutions to this week's problem set. A company is about to market a new streaming service. It decides to run ads on the Super Bowl. The company hopes the investment in this expensive advertising will result in over 40% of the public recognizing the name of the new streaming service. On the day after the Super Bowl, the advertising company conducts a survey of 420 randomly selected adults and finds that 181 of them recognize the name of the streaming service. What is proportion of the sample recognize the streaming service name? So the sample proportion was 181 out of 420. And if we make that into a decimal, we find that that's equal to 43%. The sample proportion is over 40%. Why can't we conclude the advertising campaign goal was met based on this one sample? Why is your instructor going to have you use some more statistical methods to analyze the data in the rest of the problem? What we want to find out is whether all adults, we can make this conclusion about all adults. So this is based on a sample, but what we want is a conclusion about a population. We already know the sample was greater than 40%, but what we're trying to figure out is whether that sample gives us evidence that the entire population proportion is over 40% as well. That's why we're going to keep on going. Use the sample data to test the hypothesis that the population proportion, in other words, the proportion of all adults, is greater than 40%. So we're going to walk through this step by step. First, we're going to write the null and alternative hypothesis. So we want to figure out if the population proportion, which we call P, is greater than 40%. And we would write that as P is greater than 0.40. Pardon me. So that's the alternative hypothesis. The null hypothesis always has the exact same parameters in the problem, exact same number in the problem, except it always has an equal sign. Show that the conditions for the CLT are met. That means to show that n times p, remember n is our sample size, and our sample size is 420, so 420 times 0.40, and n times 1 minus p, 420 times 0.60, you have to show that you used a calculator or your good number sense and checked that those are both greater than 10. The reason that's important is because all of our work after this is based on the assumption that even though the samples will vary from sample to sample, their shape will look like this. We're going to assume that they're centered at 40%. We could, if we wanted to, compute the spread ourselves, but we're going to let StatCrunch do that for us. So now what we're going to do is we're going to use StatCrunch to find a test statistic and a p-value. So let's go ahead and do that. Let me navigate to StatCrunch. Okay, so proportion stats, we have one group with a summary. So our number of successes is 181 out of 420. We're conducting a hypothesis test, and our hypothesis is about whether the population proportion is equal to 40% or whether it's greater than 40%. Okay, so now we'll compute. Now, we'll report the test statistic and the p-value, but remember it's the p-value that tells us whether we're going to reject our null hypothesis. So we have a test statistic of 1.29, so not very surprising, and a p-value of 0.097 or 0.098, which is also not surprising. So let's go ahead and record those. So test statistic is 1.29, and our p-value is 0.09. Let's take a look again. 0.098. All right. Based on your StatCrunch results, decide whether or not to reject your null hypothesis, and then we'll write a conclusion in plain English. Can we conclude that the goal of the ad campaign was met? In other words, do we have evidence that over 40% of all adults recognize the name of the streaming service? Okay, so this is from the notes. I just want to remind you that you have a significance level here, which is 0.05, since we weren't told to use a different one. And in order to reject your null hypothesis, your p-value has to be in this range from 0 to 0.05. If it's not in that range, we will not reject our null hypothesis. So if you think about the number line, our p-value, 0.098, would be here, to the right of 0.05. And so we are not going to reject our null hypothesis. So let's go ahead and write our conclusion. So don't reject the null hypothesis. That means there's not enough evidence to conclude. And we always write our conclusion about our alternative hypothesis. We cannot conclude that was true. In other words, we can't conclude that the proportion of adults who recognize the name of the streaming service is over 40%. So unfortunately for the company, they invested in a lot of expensive advertising, and their goal of over 40% name recognition was not met. We have no evidence it was met. Use the sample data to construct the 95% confidence interval for the proportion of all adults who recognize the streaming service. So what we did originally was we did a hypothesis test. Now we're being asked to use the same information, and instead of a hypothesis test, we'd like to make a confidence interval. So that's all we have to do, since the data is there, is just click the confidence interval button and we'll compute. So we have a lower limit of 0.384 and an upper limit of 0.478. 384,478. 384,478. Okay, so this is the confidence interval for the proportion of all adults who do recognize a streaming service name. And so we have a lower limit of 0.384 and an upper limit of 0.478. And what we believe is that the population proportion is somewhere in this range. How does your confidence interval support your conclusion? What we concluded is we don't have any evidence that it's over 40%. And some people might be thinking, well, wait a second. There's numbers here that are over 40%. Like all of those numbers would be over 40%. That's true. But there's also numbers that are under 40%. So because the interval includes numbers under 40%, that's how it supports your conclusion, because your conclusion was we cannot conclude that the population proportion is over 40%. If you're wondering, what would an interval have looked like if it had supported a conclusion that more than 40% had seen recognized the streaming service? Well, an interval like that would be something like this. This kind of interval would support a conclusion that over 40% of the population recognize the streaming service because it only includes values over 40%. But since our interval included values that were not over 40%, it supports our conclusion that there's not enough evidence to conclude that the population proportion is over 40%. It could be under 40%. You might wonder, does a hypothesis test and confidence interval always support each other? And the answer is yes. On a test, when I ask you a question like this, if you start writing things like, it doesn't support my conclusion, go back and check your work, because a confidence interval approach and a hypothesis test approach always have to lead you to the same conclusion.